Hello everybody, my name is Derek Borman and welcome to Dynamics 365 for Field Service. In this course, we're going to start to look more around specialized circumstances. We're going to talk a little bit about how do you trigger preventative maintenance functionality inside the application, and what do you want to keep in mind when you're looking at doing back office integrations as part of your field service implementation. And so really we're going to start looking at, what are agreements in field service and how can we utilize agreements from that preventative maintenance standpoint to trigger the creation of work orders on a predefined schedule, as well as when to generate invoices on a predefined schedule. We're also going to talk a little bit about the day-to-day management capabilities and the life cycle of agreements so we understand under what circumstances are these things going to get triggered inside the application. We're also going to talk a little bit about what bookings are and how those bookings and those invoices can be triggered inside the application as well. We're also going to look at customer assets, and customer assets are physical pieces of equipment that you can put on a customer location that you may trigger and you may trigger work order creation off of. It may be like a 3D printer that you need to service and maintenance as you're moving forward. We'll talk a little bit and provide a very high level overview of how the purchasing and return process works inside Dynamics 365 for field service. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about inventory management, and more specifically, how you go through and work with inventory returns, manage inventory warehouse levels, as well as manage inventory transfers inside the application. Work orders are really the cornerstone of what the field service functionality is. Obviously, somebody has some type of issue. It could be a product or service that you sell and now you need to install it, or it could just be simply a case or an item that gets escalated because we don't have the capabilities to solve it remotely. So now we need to physically dispatch somebody out into the application. Regardless of when or how you're creating work orders are really what you're going to use from a field service standpoint to define the type of work that's going to be done, who's responsible for that work, and the specific details around that information. So in this module, we're going to look at not only the different ways that you can create work orders, but the specific details around what information is captured, as well as giving you some ideas on some different ways to streamline the work order creation process. So we're going to first just talk a little bit about what are work orders, how do work orders work, talk a little bit about the different life cycle, whether they're originating from a case or from a new record themselves. How do you work through the life cycle process of a work order? We'll talk a little bit about the different records that interact with work orders, whether that's the accounts that you're physically going to and conducting the work order, or who's even just responsible for paying the bill once the work order job has been completed in the system. We'll talk a little bit about the difference between work order statuses and sub-statuses. Really, the big thing to remember with work order statuses and sub-statuses is those are going to help you trigger when things are going to be scheduled in the system. And there's certain rules and items around when to customize one versus the other. And we want to talk a little bit about what that process looks like in the system. And then finally, we'll look at how you can use incident types inside Dynamics 365 to actually streamline the creation process of work orders and populate a lot of the key information that might be beneficial based upon what work is actually being done at the customer site. Work orders really describe the essence of what information or what type of work is actually going to be done at the customer location once the technician is dispatched. So what you're going to do once the work order is created, that's really going to define the different elements that we need to take into account in regards to skill sets, the type of item that is going to actually be done while we're there, as well as to be able to determine what are the appropriate resources that we need to schedule for that work order based upon different things that we've gone through. So some of the objects that end up being on a work order are things like the service tasks. The service tasks define what needs to be done, what the products and services are that we're actually going to bill the customer for. And then within the context of the work order, we also have the capabilities to define different work order types. And that really can help drive some of the analytics and the reporting. So we know that we have a specific work order that is maybe more of an install-based work order versus a work order that's more repair-based, or maybe one that's being created from an agreement that's really focusing more around preventative maintenance. They're all going to kind of contain the same structure. While there might be different types that are defined, they're still going to really contain a lot of the same information. And so one of the key things that you'll always see on a work order is really just a description or a name of the work order that defines, okay, this is the issue or the work that we have to do while we're going out on site. We'll also need to determine who the customer is or the service account where that's taking place. And the service account does a couple of different things. It really defines this is the customer that we're going to go out and conduct this work for, but it also is used to drive the location or the physical spot where the work is going to be executed or carried out at on the customer location. The other items that you'll see that oftentimes show up on a work order are the products. So what specific parts do the technicians need to have when they're going out on site, and what services might be associated with that work order. So if you think about it from like a carpet installation standpoint, when I go out and install the carpet, I can't really install the carpet until A, we have the carpet in place. We might have an installation charge based upon maybe carpet disposal. We're trying to get rid of the old stuff. And then there might be the miscellaneous pieces like the kick pads and the different things that are going to be used to physically install the carpet at that location. And so we have the ability to define these are the actual products and services that will be associated with that. And then when you are installing carpet, depending upon the agreement that you have with the customer, as I mentioned, we might need to dispose of that information. So we also can put in the service tasks that say, okay, here's the order in which you need to execute this work order. You first need to remove the old carpet, and then we need to dispose of that carpet. Then we need to prep the floor. Then we need to put in the floorboards. Then we need to actually pull the carpet, cut the carpet. We can actually set up different service tasks that tell the technician, here's the order in which you want to receive these, along with some items around the estimated time. So we also can start to use that to predetermine how much time we might be spending working through that. And then we also have the ability, if it's a higher end type situation, or as we've mentioned in previous modules, maybe somebody's going into a secure facility or a secure location, we also can define what skills are necessary to make sure that when we are scheduling and dispatching this particular situation, it's really the right person for the right job at the right time. A typical work order is going to go through roughly about 5 stages. Now, depending upon your business cycle or your work order life cycle, they may vary a little bit based upon what specific types of services you carry out for your customers. But really, you can generally break work orders down into kind of 5 stages as you're going through. And so these next several slides walk through not only the different life cycle process of a work order, but some of the key demographic information that you want to be aware of as you're advancing this work order from one stage to another. So the first one is really around work order creation. And so what happens when we're creating a work order? Well, obviously that work order is going to get generated in the system, and then depending upon what's necessary, things like products and services and skill sets and tasks are all going to basically be assigned to that work order at that point to make sure that we know the details around what items need to be carried out. Now, one of the key things to remember is who's going to perform this. It really depends on the use case of the work order and your system processing lifecycle. So it could be generated through an agreement where we create a preventative maintenance agreement in the system that goes out and defines and creates these work orders on a specified schedule, maybe the first of the week if it's a weekly scenario, or maybe the first of the month if it's a monthly scenario. But generally it's going to be auto-generated in the system based upon criteria that we've defined. Now, another option that we might see would be actually escalating this work order and creating a work order directly through a case inside the application. So somebody has called into help desk, the person that's working the help desk hasn't necessarily been able to solve that issue, so now we need to escalate it so we physically can dispatch somebody out to work through it. The other option could be potentially that you sell these work orders. So depending upon what your business model is, you're selling this project or this service to this customer, and now we're going to work through the opportunity to find define what the information is at an opportunity level, and then generate the work order once that opportunity has been closed as part of the sales lifecycle process. The other option might just be a manual creation of a work order. Maybe somebody comes in and talks to a system dispatcher. The dispatcher is going to create the work order inside the system, or maybe the customer is creating the work order on their own terms, basically going in through a self-service portal or something similar to that. So there's a lot of different ways where the work order could be created. It's about understanding what the specific use case would be that would be specific to your organization and your organization needs. Regardless of how it's created or who created it, typically a work order is going to come in with a status of open and unscheduled, meaning that it's not necessarily been assigned to a technician at this point. It's waiting for us to schedule in the system. Now, there's usually not any bookings associated with it at that point because we don't know who's responsible for anything, because at this point, the work order has not been scheduled or defined in the system. So now we would move on to the scheduling process. And when we get into the scheduling process, a couple of different things happen. The first thing that happens is what's called a bookable resource booking record is created. And what this bookable resource booking does is that actually defines the specifics about who and under what circumstances this work order is going to be carried out. So it's typically assigned to a resource in the system who now has responsibility for it that will be carrying that information out. In addition to that, we will also populate things like the date and the time. So when are we estimated to arrive on site? How long do we think we're going to be at that customer location before we move forward? Now, as far as the scheduling process goes, that could be done any number of different ways. That could be done by a field agent. Maybe you are giving your technicians the ability to self-schedule, so now they're going to go out and schedule either through the mobile application or manually inside the web application. Maybe, as I mentioned, a dispatcher has taken that call, they've now created the work order, and now they're manually going to schedule it in the system. Or it could even just be a process where the work order has been created, and now we're going to use the schedule assistant to go out and define how that work order should be scheduled. But once a work order is scheduled, then the status of the work order typically changes from being opened and unscheduled to now it has been opened and scheduled in the system. And then as part of that, that bookable resource booking record was created, which will now have a booking status in the system as scheduled, so we now know that somebody is scheduled to conduct this work order in the future at some point in time. Once it's been scheduled, now it's going to be dispatched. And this is really going to happen by notifying the technician that they have a work order, whether it's through the manual or whether it's through the mobile application, or maybe it's just through a series of automated triggered workflows that communicate to the technician that they are now responsible for this work order at this time and this date. That's typically going to be done either by a system notification, maybe by a customer, maybe by some other mechanism, but it's usually going to get auto-generated in the system. Now, the work order status isn't really going to change at that point because we're still dispatching somebody out to work on it, so the work order is still going to be considered open and scheduled, but then the booking status will probably have modified a little bit to maybe contain a sub-status underneath it that defines the specifics. So they're not quite there yet, they're traveling, they're en route, something to that nature to let us know that this is where we are at in the process of getting this ready for somebody to work on. And then once the technician physically arrives at the location, now they're carrying out that work order. And that's typically done by a field service agent, and that's typically going to be done through the mobile application. Now, as they go through and they work on that work order, the status might change. It might change to in progress when they arrive. Now they're working through the mobile application. They're checking all the little boxes that define the service tasks that need to be carried out for that work order. And then once they've completed that work order, they might change the status of the work order to open and completed. Maybe they're changing it to open and completed because we still have an approval process that needs to be done just to make sure that all of the follow-up has been put in place in order to facilitate that. So as they're carrying out that particular situation, the booking status might change to traveling to signify that they're en route to that particular customer location, or that they're in progress once they're physically working on it. And then once they've finished that or completed that information, it might change to completed. But the booking status will vary based upon where they're at in the process of carrying out and actually working through that particular service. And then finally, once everything is done and all the information has been verified that the work we provided or did on site is indeed completed and accurate, now it will probably move through the review and the approval process at that point in time. And that's typically going to be done by either a supervisor or a manager, or maybe some back office accounting application. And what will typically happen is now the work order will change from a status of open and completed and moved into an actual closed status in the system and be marked as something like closed and posted. So now we know that that work order is ready for us to bill in the system. And then the booking status around that is typically going to be changed to completed as well. So that's kind of a look at a high level anyway in regards to how a work order is going to work its way through the creation process and then all the way through the scheduling, dispatching, service fulfillment, and then the review and the approval process. Before we go in and actually start creating some work orders in the system, I want to talk just a little bit about all the different records that are related or touch a work order. So as you're creating it, you understand how they kind of all work together to really define the specific details around the work order itself. So this visualization here does a nice job of not only telling you what happens at a work order level, but some of the related records that are going to fit into that as well. So every work order is going to have a service account that's associated with it. That service account is typically going to be the customer that we are physically going to execute this work order at. So it might be a scenario where you're going to ABC Company. ABC Company will be defined as the service account. Now underneath that there might also be a billing account, because if you think about it, we have a lot of customers that might have multiple locations, or they might have situations where they have subsidiary accounts that fall underneath their window. So the billing account is more around who's responsible for paying that bill. So you're going to need to define for each work order the service account where it's going to be executed, and then the billing account in regards to who's going to pay for it. Now, the other ones that you will see in here is what's called a resource requirement, and we'll talk a little bit more about resource requirements in the next module. But a resource requirement is really the specific information about what we need from a resource in the system to be able to execute this work order. So it's going to contain things like maintenance windows, it's going to contain things like technician preferences, it's going to contain things like start and end time preferences, but it's a requirement that's what actually gets scheduled against the engine inside the system. And then once you've scheduled that particular item or define that resource requirement, then you create a resource booking, and that resource booking defines who's actually going to be responsible for executing that in the system. Now, in addition to those key pieces of information, some of the other records that make up what you would see inside there would be work order types. Work order types are just a way that, as we mentioned, that you can categorize the work orders, and you really see that typically drawn out from a reporting standpoint. So is this a new installation? Is this a typical break fix type situation, or is this something that maybe was generated from a service contract and is really being used for preventative maintenance purposes? The other thing that you'll see in here is a priority. So the priority allows us to define how important this work order is in the grand scheme of things. Now, what's nice about the priority is as we get into things like resource scheduling optimization and some of the other kind of semi-automated processes, the priority can be taken into account to determine when this item should be scheduled. Should we try to move it up in the tree to make sure that it's scheduled sooner over other items? Or is it something that's a lower priority that we potentially could move back? So if you had an emergency situation where maybe a system was down and we needed to dispatch somebody, you might designate that priority as a high priority or a 10, and that's going to take precedence over something that's maybe a lower priority or a 1 inside the system. And then finally, the territory. And that really kind of comes back to allowing us to be able to organize these work orders and these resources by different geographical areas. So again, when we're trying to schedule it, we can make sure that we're only constituting and pulling in resources that are a part of that territory, so we can try to minimize travel time within the context of the application. Now, the other items that feed into a work order are what are called incidents. So again, if you've done anything with Dynamics 365 over the years, you also know that incident is another way of referring to cases. So this can be a little bit confusing the first time you come into the field service area because you're assuming that this is a case. An incident in Dynamics 365 for field service is really more of a common issue or something that gets reported very often. So for example, we might have a down system. That might be something that we would set up as an incident inside the application. And what the incident allows us to do is to template out a lot of the specific things that we would need in order to fix that down system. So if there are typical products and or services that always end up on down system work orders, we can create an incident and we can template that information out and say, okay, anytime we have a down system, it needs to have these 4 or 5 products. These are the 2 or 3 services that we are going to be offering as part of that work order. And then in addition, we can also define the service tasks. And think of the service tasks as, the step-by-step instructions for the technician or the to-do list. So when you arrive on site to fix this printer, you have to do this first. You have to run a quick wellness check on the printer. Then you're going to go out and you're going to check the toner levels, then maybe you're going to make sure all the gears and everything are working together. Then you're going to do an initial test run to make sure all the changes have been modified. Those are the types of things that you would typically see brought out or dictated to as part of service tasks. And then the final piece to this that can be associated with a work order is those characteristics. So, what skill set or what certification, what abilities does the technician who's going to be carrying out this work order need to possess in order to efficiently do that inside the system. And all of this information can be kind of predefined ahead of time to make that work order process or work order creation process much easier and much more efficient as you move forward. So let's look at the process of creating a work order inside the system. If I go into field service, I will see underneath work order and scheduling, I will see an area for work orders. This is where if I were going to manually create these work orders in the system, this is where I would generally go to create that process. Now keep in mind that if I was executing this through a portal, the work orders might be created on a portal, they would still show up inside the web application through the work orders area. So if I come into here and I click on work orders, I can see all of the work orders that have been generated inside the system. Now next to these work orders, I also have the ability to see, the current system status of each one of these work orders. Have they been scheduled? Are they currently unscheduled? Are they in progress? And a lot of that information is going to populate itself based upon what the technician is doing at that specific moment in time inside the application. I also have the ability to see what type of work order it is. Again, from a clarification or from an application standpoint, it just makes it easier from a reporting mechanism to be able to define what those items are. Now, if I were to come into here and click on New, now I can generate a new work order in the system. Now, some of the key things that we want to talk about is the work order number itself. Now, inside the field service and administration settings, I have the ability to come in here and define a starting number in the system. So if I don't define a starting number in the system, it's basically going to start with 0 and it will start auto numbering the information from there. Now I have the ability to come in here and start defining some of the specifics. Now, just for ease purposes, I'm just going to collapse the business process flow just so we have a little bit more room. Now, the first thing we talked about was that service account. So where am I actually going to be conducting this work at? So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to click A Datum Corporation. And now I've said, okay, this is where I'm going to execute this information inside the system. Now you'll also notice that as soon as I define that information, it also comes in and it makes the billing account the same customer. Because more times than not, the person that is going to be paying the bill is generally the same person or the same physical location where I will be carrying that work order out. But again, if it's not, it's very easy for us to just switch that billing account to a different account based upon our items. Now again, as the item is coming in here, I can see that this is defaulted to an open unscheduled scenario. This is typically going to be modified automatically as this work order advances through the work order lifecycle. So in here, I now have the ability to see that it's currently open and unscheduled, field. But as I were to go out and assign technicians and physically start dispatching people to go out and conduct this information, that system status will change in the system. Now, I'll talk a little bit more about system statuses and sub-statuses in just a little bit, but it gives you an idea as far as how those things work through. A substatus allows you to provide a more detailed explanation as to the specific status of this work order. So for example, it might be open and unscheduled in the system, but why is it open and unscheduled? It could be very simply that it's open and unscheduled because the parts that we're waiting for in order to execute this work order have not arrived yet. And so what this system status or substatus allows us to do is to create different levels that can help us better define why it is in that state, or more appropriately, as we're moving forward, we can use those mechanisms to customize the system as we move forward, and we could even use that to trigger some of the scheduling capabilities moving forward, simply based upon somebody going in and modifying the substatus inside the system. Now, I'm not going to do too much with that right now. I'll leave that where it is. But if I keep scrolling down, now I see this primary incident type. Now, I'm going to skip the primary incident type for just a second, and I'm going to scroll down into the settings where it talks about some of the general information around this work order. So the first thing that you'll see here is the work order type. This is that item that we can use to define what type of work order this is in the system. Is it an installation? Is it an inspection? Is it break fix? This, again, from a reporting standpoint, allows us to define the specifics around this so we can use that to better report on what's happening. We also see the price list in here, and as we talked about a little bit earlier, each work order can have a price list associated with it, so that way as products and services are added to the work order, that price list lets us know here's the pricing information that's going to be specific to anything associated with that. And then I also see the priority and the service territory in here as well. Now, I skipped the incident type for a second, and I'm going to come back to that. An incident type, as I mentioned, this makes it easier for whoever is creating these work orders in the system to define the specific information around that work order. Because we still need to know what products need to be associated with this work order. We still need to know what services, what skill sets, and all of that information. And a primary incident makes it easier for us to define what that information looks like. So when I come over here and click on primary incident type, these are some of the incident types that are currently in the system. So if I were to say that this is a MRI installation, what's interesting about that is as I come in, it will automatically populate the primary incident estimated duration based upon service tasks that are already associated with the MRI installation incident type. Now, if I keep scrolling down, the other thing that it's also done is it's pre-populated the work order type. So I know that since this is an installation, it's more than likely a work order type of installation. I could change this, but it kind of goes back to that data mapping situation to make it easier for me to define what that information looks like. It also pre-populated my price list based upon the fact that this incident type had a price list associated with it. Again, trying to make it as easy as possible for people to identify those situations as we move forward. Now, in addition to that, I could also come back and say, okay, the priority of this is going to be a moderate priority. The service territory, this needs to take place in Washington. I could pre-populate some of this information if I had a territory associated with an account record inside the system. Now, the other thing that you'll see in here is where it talks about like the time from promised, time to promised. We're going to talk more about those in the next module, but this gets around specifics around the work order itself. Did we make any promises to the customer that we need to be aware of based upon those items? And then finally, over on the side, you'll see a taxable scenario. This allows us to define if the information on this work order is taxable or not. Then if we had gone in and created our sales tax codes like we did earlier, now I would be able to come in and define what type of sales tax codes I want to use within that, so it makes sure that we can better populate the taxing information. If you have taxable set to yes, then you do have to have a sales tax code defined, or you will not be able to save the item within the system itself. Now at this point, it's for the most part ready for us to create or define that we're ready to schedule in the system. So I do have the ability in here to just go ahead and click on save. This is going to save the work order in the system, and it will default in with that specific work order status that we talked about. Now, as I'm working through this, I would also have business process flows in here that I could now use to guide the dispatcher or whoever is responsible for that work order through the scheduling process in the system itself. Now, the other thing that I want to show you, I'm going to just real quick go back into work orders. And I can see this new work order for ADatum Corporation right here in the system. If I open this up and I scroll back down, the other thing that you're going to see in here is now underneath service tasks, I actually have a task list that is now attached to this particular work order. This kind of ties back to that incident type or those incidents that we talked about earlier. These are all the different tasks that would typically need to be done in order to facilitate completion of this work order. And so as the technician is working through this, they can basically mark this information off as to how complete it is, and that could also be used to drive the billing status as we move forward. So now we know how much time was actually spent corresponding and working on that. So by creating those incident types and utilizing that MRI installation incident type, I now have these service tasks pre-populated. If I continue to scroll down, I can see that certain products have been defined for this based upon the incident type, as well as specific services. This, again, really aids in the ease of creation of these work orders by simply defining what that information is when you move forward. Now this work order is ready for us to schedule in the system, and we'll go ahead and we'll walk through that process a little bit later on when we get into the scheduling and dispatching model. When we created the work order, we talked real briefly about work order statuses. And I want to come back to that a little bit and dive into that a little bit deeper, because the work order status is very important to how you're going to not only execute the work order or maintain the status of what's happening in that work order, but it's also very critical to some of the automations that happen behind the scenes. And so just a couple of things that are a little bit different with field service than some of the typical Dynamics 365 entities that you might work with. Work order status is not a system status field like you would normally see around cases and opportunities. It's actually a lookup field that looks up specific lookup records that have been pre-created as part of the solution. And so out of the box, you're going to have some system statuses like open unscheduled, open scheduled, in progress, completed, closed posted, closed canceled. What we usually tell people is try not to customize those a whole lot. Particularly try not to either delete the ones that are there or replace the ones that are there. There's a lot of back-end workflows and custom actions and different functionality that is specifically tied to work order statuses. And so by going in and tweaking some of those, you do have the potential to break some of that out-of-the-box functionality. Now, obviously, we understand that there are needs to have some of these different statuses in the system. So you can always add statuses. That's not going to hurt too much, but customizing the ones that are there can sometimes lead to behavior that you weren't expecting is probably the best way to say that. So what we usually tell people is that's where that substatus option comes into play. By going in and creating additional substatuses or by modifying the existing substatuses, now you have the capabilities to really still accomplish those customizations that we're looking at in the system, but not necessarily have any scenarios where you might potentially break something. So from an open unscheduled standpoint, I could add or define a substatus that says, okay, I'm waiting for parts. And now once those parts have arrived, we could update the substatus to parts have arrived, and now we could utilize that functionality to trigger some of that methodology to how you're going to schedule it inside the system moving forward. So it's always a good practice to not really do a whole lot with the system status field around the work order, but really focus more on the sub status. And so let's go ahead and just show you a little bit around the sub statuses inside the application. So I'm going to go back into field service and I'm going to go back into administration. And in this administration area, underneath priorities, I will see a work order substatuses. So this is where I can now define those specific substatuses around the work order itself. So you can see that we already have items in here for, parts received or purchase order required or some of those options. Now I would have a situation where I could come into here, I could create a new work order substatus. Maybe I'm going to call this on hold. And now I'm going to associate this with a specific substatus. So this now, or with a specific system status. So now this allows me to still use the system status without having to do a bunch of customizations to it, but I can now use this substatus of on hold to better define why this particular situation at this moment in time anyway has not been scheduled within the system. Now, if this was going to be the default substatus for this particular organization, I do also have the ability to set default substatuses in the system as well. But at this point, we'll just go ahead and hit save and close. And now this substatus would be available for us to use as we were moving forward. Before we leave the work order creation process, I want to come back to just a few fields that we talked a little bit about earlier, but just to really drive home how important some of these fields are as you move forward. When you start talking about, field service-based KPIs or reporting and analytics, or even just using some of the resource scheduling optimization utilities to automate some of the scheduling processes within the application, it's important to understand how some of the other fields in the system are going to impact that. So we talked quite a bit already about work order type, but depending upon what your delivery model is within your field service implementation, I do recommend going into field service and administration and defining specific work order types that really are in line with how you execute information inside your application. So is it an inspection, a break fix, an install, something to that nature? Remember that price lists are going to drive how the customers are billed. And so again, going back to what we talked a little bit earlier around products and price lists, it's important to understand what price lists you need for a field service implementation, but also to keep in mind that you are adding the appropriate products to those price lists. So if you're pre-populating the price list through an incident type or even just manually adding the price list to the work order, we know that the products that are coming in there are products that are specific to that price list, and we're using the correct pricing in that work order. The priority, priority does a few different situations, but remember, if you're going to ultimately lead into assisted scheduling or optimizing schedules within the application, understanding what specific priorities you have in your organization are very important. So if you go into field service and administration, there is a priority area where you can customize that entity to define what a low priority is, what a normal priority is, or maybe you have different terminology that you utilize for those options. That also gives you the capabilities to go in and just define what those custom priorities might look like inside the application. Now, we talked about the service account, being the work location or where the work is actually going to take place, but sometimes based upon today's new support models, we might still be going out and conducting the work for ADATM Corporation, but we might be conducting the work remotely. So where the work location comes into play is it specifies, is this somebody that's coming in to our physical location? They're bringing something in and we're going to be working at it at our physical location? Are we sending somebody out on site to physically go to that location and now conduct that information? Or are we doing something remotely? So this can help us better define where that work will be taking place, aside from just who the service account is that we're actually conducting the work for. And then depending upon how this work order was created, this could be a child work order that is coming off of a parent work order. This could be generating from an agreement. This may have been a work order that is being executed based upon an opportunity that was in the system, or it may have even been created from a case. So what the related to records allow us to see is, if this work order generated from a case in the system, what was that case that it came from? Or what was that agreement that was used to initiate or create this work order inside the system? And so you do have the ability at all stages of the items to be able to come in and see what related records are associated with this work order. And then finally, the preferences area, which we will again talk quite a bit about in the next module, but that's really around the resource requirements, helping to define, what time, what dates we need to be there. Do they have any technician preferences? That way, when we're trying to schedule this in the system, we can ensure that, whatever we've promised to the customer or whatever the customer is expecting, we are achieving that by maintaining and meeting the preferences that were agreed upon between us and the customer. I'd like to take a moment and come back to incidents and incident types in field service. As you can see, when we created that last work order, there's a lot of information that we need to capture to make sure that the technician has everything that they need at their disposal in order to effectively carry out that work order. We need to know what skill sets they need to possess. We need to know what products and services. We need to know what the expectation is from a task list perspective. And that can take a lot of time to create if you're trying to go into the system and manually define that for each work order that you're utilizing. And so that's really where incident types and incidents can save a lot of time in the system. Again, think of them as templates. Think of them as things that you can create that define very common issues that are reported by your customers that typically have the same resolution process. It's these same 5 tasks, or it's these same 2 or 3 products and services that are almost always added to a work order when it falls under this particular situation. And so think of incidents and incident types as a way to pre-populate that information automatically at the time when the work order is created. And that's why when we created that initial work order, we saw the duration and some of those things auto-populate in the system. So these are a great way that you can meet with your organization or your customers if you're implementing for other people, and define what those common situations are, and then build out incidents or incident types based upon those individual requirements that they might have. Now, there's a lot of different things that get defined at an incident type level, and we'll just hop into the application here in just a couple seconds and walk you through that. But some of the key things that you're going to see is, what type of work order is it? Is it a break fix? Is it an install? Is it preventative maintenance? What skills or characteristics should that technician have that is going to be executing or working on that incident type as they move forward? What are the specific tasks? What are the 5 things or 6 things that they need to do in order to be working through that? And then also, are there any specific products and or services that also need to be included as part of that situation as well? So let's hop into the application and let's create a little bit around incidents, and then we'll kind of come back and we'll show you how that all works together. You do need to create your incidents or your incident types through the administration screen inside field service. So again, if I were to go to field service and navigate to administration, one of the areas that I'll see in here is incident types. So this is where I can create those and define those specific incident types that I want to use inside the system. So in here, I'm going to go ahead and click on New. And I'm just going to give this a name. So depending upon what that common issue might be, maybe we're going to call this monthly printer care. Defines what goes into monthly printer service. So now when I come into here, I need to first and foremost define what the default work order type is. So in this case, this is going to be kind of a preventative maintenance situation. So I'm going to go ahead and hit preventative maintenance. Now we haven't really had a chance to work on agreements yet, and we'll talk about agreements in just a couple more modules. But think of an agreement as a way to automate scheduling of things that need to happen on a reoccurring basis. And one of the things that's nice about agreements is I can copy incidents or tasks that are associated with an incident automatically to work orders that are created via an agreement. And so that's where this allows me to say, if I'm creating an agreement, do I want to copy that information automatically? Now in this case, I'm going to just go ahead and kind of leave it where it is for now, and I'm going to go ahead and hit save. And so the first thing that we need to say is, okay, if somebody is doing this preventative maintenance or doing this monthly printer care, are there certain skill sets that this person should have in order to be able to facilitate that? So in where it says characteristics, I'm going to go ahead and click on my add button. I'm going to define the characteristic. And then this is where that proficiency model comes into play and say, okay, anybody who's coming in and doing this monthly printer care, they need to have Building 12 access, and they need to have high security clearance in order to facilitate that. So now I can go ahead and hit save and close, and that's going to associate this characteristic with this particular incident or incident type. Now if I wanted to add another item to this, I could just very simply hit add again, define what the next option might be that they would need to have in this situation, and I'll say, okay, now they need to also understand C#, and they just need to be mildly good in that situation. Now I'm going to continue to scroll down, and I'm going to skip service tasks here for just a second, and I'm going to talk specifically about products and services. So remember, when you're working with a work order, there might be specific, maintenance kits or items that need to also be a part of that, so I can bill that back to the customer. So now where it says products, I can come into the products area and I can define any specific products that need to be associated with this work order based upon price listing information and other options. So I'm going to come into here, I'm going to choose the product that I want to work with in this scenario. Maybe in this case, I'm just going to go ahead and I'll just say this monitor for right now. How many of these are we going to have? We're only going to have one. And then I can go ahead and save and close this. Now, keep in mind, I didn't do a whole lot with pricing in items because the work order itself is going to have a price list that's associated with it. So as this product gets added to that work order based upon that price list, some of that information around the pricing and the costing is going to automatically get set up at that point in time once it is actually added to a work order that's going to be defined. And that same situation would be true with services. Now I would go into services, I would define the service itself, select the service from the available services that are attached to my product catalogs and my items. So now in here, I'm going to say that I have a performance inspection. We suspect that the performance inspection is going to take an hour. And then I can go ahead and save and close this. And so you would just keep building that information as part of the incident type. So once this is selected in the system, it's going to auto-generate that information for us. The final piece to the incident type concept is the service task types. So think of service tasks as the to-do list. So these are the specific things that the agent is going to have to do while they're going out and they're conducting that information on a customer location. Now, what's nice about these service task types is as I'm creating these, I can specify specific things like the duration of that service task. And so as I add multiple service tasks to this work order, all of that duration information is going to roll up and pre-populate the work order duration inside the application. So there's a couple of different ways that service tasks can be created. You could go in and you could just define service tasks through field service administration, and then you could simply add the service tasks to the incident type at the time of creation. Or what I typically will do is, as I'm creating the incident type, I can create and define the service tasks that I want to use at that point in time as well. The nice thing is different incidents or different work orders might use the same service task. So then that way I don't have to reinvent the wheel every single time I want to come in and work through this. If I already have service tasks that are defined with specific durations, I can just go ahead and reuse those as many times as I need to across different incidents and different work orders as I'm moving forward. So let's take a look at how you would generate and create these service tasks inside the app. I'm still in that work order or that incident type that we created a little bit earlier, but now I want to focus specifically on the service tasks piece. So I'm going to expand service tasks and I'm going to hit add. And now I'm going to define the task itself. So if I were to go out here and do something from a printer perspective, these are items that I might actually want to look at initially as I'm going through. So the first thing that I need to do as part of my items is I just need to do an inspection. So I'm going to select this inspection task. It realized, based upon this inspection task already being created in the system, that the estimated duration is going to be about 30 minutes, and it's going to add it to this monthly printer care. So now I could go ahead at this point in time and I could save and close that, and that would add that service task to this printer. Now I could come into here again and I could add another item into this particular scenario. Now this time, rather than utilizing one that's already there, I'm going to create a new service task from scratch. So now when I click on the lookup window, I can hit the new button here, and it will take me into my editor where I can now define the specifics around this particular service task. So in this case, maybe we're going to talk about replacing toner. And we know that when we're replacing toner, that's typically going to take, we'll just be on the conservative side and say 30 minutes. And then I can go ahead and I can hit save and close. That's going to commit this task type to the system, and then it's going to auto-populate this task type into this incident type and say, okay, replacing toner is going to be roughly 30 minutes. Now I can hit save and close on this option, and it's added that item to my monthly printer care. And then finally, I'm going to do one more just to finish it off at this point in time, and that is that I have to obtain a customer signature. So now I'm going to come into here and I'm going to collect a customer signature. I know from past experiences that that's actually not 30 minutes, even though that's the default. Let's say that takes typically 15 minutes to do, and now I can hit save and close. And so now I have my incident type ready for me to utilize in the system. It's got my tasks and my information pre-populated, and then once I go in and I actually save this and I work through the information, now the estimated duration will be kind of pre-populated in the system. So now if I were to come into here and go back into field service and work orders, now I'm going to create a new work order. This time I'm going to create it for Blue Yonder Airlines. I'm going to choose my primary incident type of monthly printer care. I can see that the primary incident estimated duration is pre-populated based upon the information that I've defined. I also can see that the work order type, the price list, and other information has been defined in that situation. I'm going to modify this priority to low. I'm going to pick my sales tax code of out of state. Now if I were to go ahead and save and close this, obviously there's a workflow that runs behind the scenes on this, and if you are familiar with how workflows work inside Dynamics 365, it is not a real-time situation. It takes a little bit to populate that. So now that it's had a little bit of time to populate that information, I could again open this work order back up in the system, and now if I were to scroll down into my service tasks, I can see that the service tasks that we just created or defined inside that record have now been populated based upon those items. So when you're getting ready to facilitate this for your organization or a customer, really utilize the power of incident types, because it can save you a lot of time during that work order creation process. Work orders inside field service are not necessarily considered closed until the status is changed. And so if you remember, we talked a little bit earlier about understanding that the field service solution is a little bit different, and it doesn't necessarily subscribe to that whole active inactive scenario, since it uses the work order status to really, or the system status field to really define how you're moving through that. Simply going in and completing a work order does not necessarily mean that it's closed or ready to trigger invoicing information inside the application. So you do have to set that work order status to closed and posted before you can really do anything substantial with the application itself. Now, the thing to remember is there may be an approval process that comes into play in that situation, or there may be other mechanisms that are going to trigger that closed and posted functionality. So you may need to go in and write some workflows or other items that trigger when that closed and posted status should actually be defined within the application. Now, once that item is set to closed and posted, I do have the capabilities to go in and define when invoices should be created inside the system, and I can define what those triggers look like through field service and administration. So the next thing I want to show you is how we go in and just kind of define when things are going to trigger some of the invoicing functionality inside the application. When I go into field service and administration, one of the areas that I see in here is this field service settings. And so when I click on field service settings, this gives me the capabilities to really modify how the application is going to behave inside the system. And so this is where I can do things like if I want to have a prefix for work orders, or if I want to have a starting work order number. Remember, we talked about the fact that unless you specify something, it's typically just going to start at 0. But if you have a numbering prefix that you want to utilize in the system, you can do that. And so one of the areas that you see in here is this work order completed status. This is where I can define what does a completed work order look like. Is it truly open completed, or do I want to maybe define some different statuses that would be utilized in those situations? And then finally, the invoice isn't going to get generated until the work order has typically been posted. And so one of the other options that I see in here is this is where I can define when that invoice should get created. I want to create that invoice when the work order is considered posted, or I never want to create an invoice in the system because maybe potentially I'm going to use an external application or some type of third-party option to trigger some of that in the application. And then in addition to that, I also have the capabilities where if I want to define, work pay types, business closure pay types, travel pay types, this is where if I have different rates that I'm working through different items, I can define what those situations are inside the application. But the big thing that you want to keep in mind in here is that work order invoice creation as well as that default work order completion status. By going in and just making some very simple customizations and some simple modifications to the system, you really have the capabilities to dictate and personalize what that work order experience looks like inside Dynamics 365 for field service. So as you're getting ready to deploy or implement the application, as I mentioned, really take some time to meet with your organization and really discuss what does a work order look like and what does that work order life cycle look like as we progress through. And that's going to help you to dictate and drive the customizations that you're working with. And then the other thing that you want to keep in mind is there's a lot of just core pieces of built-in functionality that are also going to help drive and dictate how work orders are resolved and worked with inside the application. And that also starts a little bit with the service account. Remember that every work order that you're going through needs to have a service account defined for them when they're created. Even if you were going to create this work order for internal purposes, we still need to go in and define who the service account is that this work order is being created against inside the application. Remember that the work order status field or the system status field, that defines the schedule or the status of the work order inside the application. That's that whole unscheduled or open unscheduled, open scheduled, open completed. And it is recommended that from a customization standpoint, we don't necessarily do a lot of customizations to that particular field, and that we focus more on the substatus field because we can utilize that to really trigger some additional functionality based upon what we would want to work with. Now, if you have a scenario where you have a lot of customers that are generally reporting the same type of thing, and so your technicians are carrying out very similar service requests for different customers, simply going in and creating incident types can save your organization a lot of time, because you can streamline the creation of those work orders by pre-populating things like the services that are going to be provided, the products that are going to be used, as well as the specific service tasks or the to-do list that the technician's going to need to follow as they work through. And then the other thing to remember is once the work orders are actually completed, the actual record's not deactivated in the application. It's still going to be considered, completed and open inside the application. You do need to remember that the work order could still potentially be modified, and that invoicing is not necessarily going to be triggered until you go in and set the status of that work order to physically closed and posted, whether that's going to be through some type of manual process based upon the needs of your customers, or whether that's going to be something that you're going to trigger automatically. But understand that when an invoice would need to be created, and then you can dictate through settings and administration how you would go in and customize when that invoice is actually going to be created inside the app.